Hello, my name is Kathy Amadeus, and our project was on the impact of trauma that undocumented children experience or face. Our project goes over the mental aspect, the emotional aspect, the physical aspect of trauma that the children can experience as a result of their migration to the United States. Trauma is accumulated through the traumatic experience that children are facing. I think it's important. Undocumented children. I think it's important to first establish what that is, or what children who are undocumented, what that basically means. So undocumented children are documented individuals. They're individuals who do not have a legal status in the United States, and this presentation will focus on the various aspects of trauma that these individuals are facing as a result of trying to come to the United States, or once they are in the United States. So my segment of the presentation, or our slides, was specifically on the physical trauma that children can endure. So children who are traveling to the United States, either pre-migration, peri-migration, or post-migration, most often children are experiencing trauma in these different areas. It could either be in all three stages, one stage, two stages, or in two stages, but children are experiencing some type of trauma. So yes, let me just change this slide. So before migration and during migration, the reasons that children can be, or children or families are immigrating to the United States, these reasons can vary. Sometimes they're immigrating to the United States because of gang violence, or they're trying to escape abusive families. They're trying to find a better life, better resources, better chance of getting an education or employment in the United States. Or sometimes when some families or some children, they already have some people that already immigrated to the United States, so their goal of coming to the United States is to reunify with those individuals that are already here. So like I said, some children are already immigrating for certain reasons, such some of those reasons being gang violence and abusive families. That would be considered physical trauma, because the child or the individual is experiencing bodily harm or bodily injury due to another person or due to another force. And also during pre-migration, so when children are in their home countries, they can also experience neglect, physical and sexual abuse, sexual assault, abandonment, kidnapping, interpersonal violence, and these all have some sort of aspect of physical trauma to it. So children can experience physical trauma before they even start their migration process. During the migration process, which is also called peri-migration, children can experience starvation, desertion, rape, sexual assault again, molestation, gang violence, physical abuse, kidnapping, incarceration, etc. And these are all different aspects of physical trauma again. So if a child has experienced pre-migration trauma and then peri-migration trauma, the trauma that the child is experiencing, it's just snowballing, and it's adding on to the stress and the bodily harm that the child is going through. So the physical trauma is just accumulating. Or if the child is just experiencing during peri-migration, this is a start for trauma to keep going. Let me just change this. Okay. Once arriving to the United States, undocumented children are processed by Customs and Border Patrol. Children who are accompanied, this means without an adult or a guardian or someone that's supervising them, they are placed into detention centers specifically. And then once children are deemed unaccompanied, these minors are then transferred into the custody of a separate department, and the separate department is called the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And then once in this department, the children will be placed into foster homes or shelters. so that they can undergo the separate process of immigration, so that they either can become a citizen or get their green card to stay in the United States, or they will be deported. But children are taken out of these detention centers to be placed in foster homes and shelters if they are deemed unaccompanied. Children or who arrive with family members into the United States, sometimes these families can have a sponsor, or they can get a sponsor while they're waiting, and then these sponsors can basically they advocate and they say that they'll stay with the family, that they'll be the people that the family are gonna stay with, or the children's, or whoever the children's going to stay with, and while they're in the United States or while they're waiting. And I think it's important to note that sometimes these sponsors, they don't have the best intention. They can have ill intentions towards the family or the child. And if the sponsor does have ill intentions, they can exploit the child. They can physically or sexually abuse the child, which would then also add to the physical trauma that the child is enduring because of the ill intention that the sponsor may have. This is not always the case, but this can be the case sometimes, so I think it's important to know. And then another avenue that children or families can take is that they can petition for asylum. However, in most cases, children and families are separated from each other if they come together, and this is stemming from the No Tolerance Policy Act that the Trump administration put into place. When Trump left presidency, this policy was officially taken away, but I read some reports and some research that states that even though the policy was taken away and it was disbanded, that the separation is still happening. So I thought that was also important to note in my presentation. And then once children are in these detention centers, or once they arrive to the United States, they can also experience more physical trauma in these detention centers. Research shows that children can experience physical abuse, verbal abuse, racism. There's issues with sanitary and hygiene in these detention centers. There can be sometimes in some of these detention centers, it's reported that the children, the individuals are refused medical care. Sometimes they reported that they were kicked, being mistreated and neglected. And in these detention centers, if the child is experiencing this, like I said, the physical trauma that the child is further accumulating because of what they're experiencing in the detention centers, or what they experience peri-migration or pre-migration. Especially if the child is refused medical care, the detention centers are not accounting for the physical injuries or the illnesses or diseases that the child may have incurred during their traveling, or during their migration period, or before the migration period. So when they're in detention centers and they have these issues of standards and medical care and inadequate staffing, it's further exacerbating the physical trauma that the child is experiencing, because their bodily injuries or their diseases or illnesses can become worse, and sometimes this can lead to death because the children are not being treated properly, both physically, mentally, and medically. And most of these times, these detention centers don't have the adequate resources to treat children with the standards that we would have as normal citizens. The children are not, some of these detention centers are not being treated with care, or being treated culturally sensitive to what they may have experienced prior. And then post-migration. So once undocumented children, they are granted citizenship, or they're granted a green card, they're sponsored, or they're granted asylum, they can further face trauma once they're immersed and become involved as citizen part of the country. Because, for example, when immigrant youth are placed, or they find home for the children in the United States, most of the times they're placed into low-income neighborhoods, and these neighborhoods can make them more susceptible to poverty and criminality, because they're not placed in areas that have the best reputation or the best care for the child, and this become triggering or stress for the child, because they may experience things that they experienced. They may become triggered and may relive experiences that they experienced in the detention centers, or they experienced during their peri-migration or pre-migration. It's just further adding onto the physical trauma that the child is experiencing, because once a child experiences so much trauma, it's gonna take both a physical and mental and emotional toll on the child. And then in order to combat this, some research has found that children are developing coping strategies as a way to deal with the trauma they experience, because it might be a lot that the child experienced either in the 3 stages. Like I said, children can experience trauma, physical trauma, throughout all 3 stages, or in 1 stage, or 2 stages, or in just 2 stages, but still, the child is experiencing some type of trauma. And then they develop these coping strategies to help them deal with the trauma, such as problem solving, problem focused coping, emotional coping, religious coping, and positive style coping. Like religious coping, for example, is when a child leans heavily into a certain religion or faith so that they can find hope, or they can find some type of explanation for what they experience. So when these coping strategies, sometimes they're positive, sometimes they're negative. One coping strategy that's negative is avoidance. Basically, avoidance is when the child doesn't, they basically avoid, or like don't want to address their trauma, and then because they're not addressing it, the trauma just becomes worse. And not only on the physical aspect that they may experience, but sometimes when the physical trauma, it has an effect on the child, and then it be worse and becomes mental and emotional trauma. When they're avoiding this, it can research has found that it links to social withdrawal, and it links to the increased use of drugs and alcohol, because the child is choosing to avoid their trauma, and then in actuality it's furthering their physical trauma, because they're leaning into these unhealthy habits as a result of the trauma that they experience. And then these unhealthy habits are further impacting them, because it can decrease their life expectancy, or they can lead to diseases or illnesses that the children can experience, or like go through, such as cancer. And that's just furthering their physical trauma later down in life, because what the child has experienced, now if they're avoiding the problem, sometimes their actions are further leading to more actions that can physically harm the child or the individual. So physical trauma is, you can't just look at it in one scope. Physical trauma leads to emotional and mental trauma. And physical trauma, it's just not, it's like most people think it's only experienced during the migration to the United States, but physical trauma can be experienced before the child even migrated, when they migrate, and when they are in the United States. So you can't just see physical trauma from one lens. You have physical trauma includes all 3 stages of when the child is immigrating. The undocumented child is immigrating to the United States, and the physical trauma sometimes doesn't just stay the physical trauma. It morphs and becomes mental and emotional trauma, which can, in some cases, be a situation that can be worse for the child if they don't properly deal with the trauma at hand. Thank you.